as you know, the festival has been featuring a number of different threads, one of which from the beginning of the festival itself has always been a reconnection with diaspora, a reckoning with Goa's diaspora. And so it gives us immense pleasure for this particular, and also we've had a series of book launches, exclusive book launches. As you know, we've released a book a wonderful book by a novel from Mamang Dai. We had Rajdeep's hometown book launch, which Defense Minister Parikar came for. We've had the release of a brand new biography, an extraordinary biography by the great Dr. Rajmohan Gandhi. And we've had a couple of Konkani book launches, our own Damodar Mahoso, our own Mahabaleshwar sale. And I've been told not to introduce, which is running a little bit against my grain. But nonetheless, I will not introduce much, but I do want to say a couple of things that over the past few years, a very important work of cultural and social history retrieval has been done by this author, who is very much from Goa, but she's done it abroad, and it's been a very tireless and I must say unique labor, clearly of love, and it's added a great deal to all of our understandings of diaspora. And very, very proud that she has chosen the Goa Arts and Literary Festival to launch a very, very interesting book about a very, very interesting part of Goan history and culture. I'd like to ask for a big hand. We're very proud of you, Selma. Selma Carvalho.
Thank you. I actually thought I'd have just my mom in the room, so I didn't really prepare my speech. Now I find that I have Mr. Mr. Gandhi, who is the grandson of the great Mr. Gandhi. So now I am completely nervous. So anyway, since we're pressed for time, I'm going to keep my introduction as brief as possible. Thank you all for coming. And I want to thank Galf for inviting me to present my book, A Railway Runs Through Goans of British East Africa. We're going to explore the book briefly in a panel discussion. But to introduce the subject matter to you, I want to start by reading a few lines of a review that was written of the book. And this review is written by Mr. Peter Fullerton, who was a district commissioner, a British district commissioner in Kenya, and he worked with Goans. And this is what he had to say. All of us who served in East Africa will know what a contribution the Goans made, whether serving as clerks and cashiers in remote boroughs or as staff at the Secretariat. Their competence, integrity, and uncomplaining attitude, often in arduous conditions, made them colleagues of exceptional value. Now, a few days ago, a discussion broke out in cyberspace, that great big citadel of democracy in the 21st century. And another Goan author, a well-known Goan author, had this to say about East African Goans. And incidentally, I do have his permission to quote him. This is what he said. How can a person born and raised in Africa until 30 years of age not have any feelings for the Africans? Sure, they remember the good old days when they were coddled and trusted by the British, and here he's talking about Goans, and had African servants to cook, wash, and care for their children, while they played cards and drank in the Goan clubs. This is a shameful chapter in their lives. Now, both these very divergent points of view are valid, and neither one of them should be dismissed out of hand. Because between these two polar points, one which sees the Goan as a contributor, and the other that sees the Goan as a collaborator of the British, lies a legacy which spans over 100 years and 3 generations. Now, the same author also said of me that I have romanticized this legacy. And he's right, I have romanticized this legacy. I've taken a narrative which was mostly forgotten by Goans, and I've romanticized it, and I've glamorized it, and I've turned it into a mini novel with all heroes and no villains. And in part, this is because this is my story. It's very personal to me. It's a story about my grandfather, who at the age of 16 leaves Goa and goes to East Africa, Nairobi, in circa 1914, when there's absolutely nothing happening in Africa. There are no towns, there's barely anything to say that this is civilization. And like so many young men, and young men in those days left Goa at 16 or 18, he would have been part of, and he would have witnessed the very laying of the foundation of Nairobi. And so, yes, this is a personal story to me. But there will come writers after me who will be braver than me, and who will write braver things. And we have to be ready for that. We can't insulate ourselves from criticism. Because the mark of a true evolving society is genuine introspection about what our role has been. And so the purpose of history is not just to honor the past, but it's also to reflect upon it and to learn from it. Now, the second and final point I want to make comes from this question that's very often asked: how is it relevant, something happening in East Africa, how is it relevant to us Goans today? And the answer to that is the transformations taking place in Goan society in East Africa were not taking place in isolation. They were filtering back to Goa, and they were taking root in Goa. And so they were becoming part of our national consciousness. And apart from the modest affluence that East African Goans brought into Goa, this widening of the middle class and this giving rise to a petty bourgeois class, they also brought with them a new modernity into Goa, a different sort of modernity. And as I write in my book, the urbanization, modernization, and secularization of Goans began in the British civil services. I'm now going to call up on two of my panelists, and we're going to discuss the contents of the book through conversation, and then we shall open it up for questions from the audience. And also later, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Alan Rodrigues, who's the grandson of Dr. A.C.L. D'Souza, and he will be releasing the book. So my first panelist is Dr. Benedito Ferrao. If Dr. Ferrao could just make his way here. Dr. Ferrao is a writer and a researcher, and he's currently with the Mellon Faculty in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the College of William and Mary, Virginia. His research centers on literary representations of Goans in transnational contexts. A writer of fiction, creative nonfiction, op-eds, and literary criticism, Ferrao's work has been published internationally. In 2014, he was awarded the Analysis Prize by the San Francisco Peninsula Press Club. And my second fellow panelist for today is Mr. Eddie Fernandes. If Mr. Fernandes could make his way here. Fernandes is known to many of you East African Goans, and he's a graduate. Maybe you want to sit closer to Benedito. He's a graduate of St. Xavier's College, Bombay. He's an Associate Library Association UK and an honorary research staff of the UCL London. He's a former librarian of the UCL, and he's most notable for being the editor of Goan Voice UK, and he grew up in Mombasa, and he brings with us a lived experience of East Africa. And Benny is going to chair this session, so I'm going to hand over the mic to him.
Thanks very much. Congratulations, Selma, on the release of the book. The musical chairs. And it's a great pleasure to be able to have this conversation with both of you and the audience who are all gathered together today, of course, to think about and reflect on the Goan legacy in East Africa. Both of you have brought a different light, if you will, to the study and the thinking of the Goan chapter in East Africa. But I thought we'd begin by maybe you, Selma, sharing a little bit about how the Goans came to be in East Africa in the first place, possibly starting around the time that you spoke with your grandfather migrating to East Africa.
Yeah, I think 1914, which was the year that I mentioned, would be a little later because we know that the migration started in the 1860s. And how they came to be in East Africa, we can't say for one certain factor which brings them there. But we know that there are these very fluid lives of people working on ships that are moving between the Indian Ocean and Africa. And so there's a fluid population of people going back and forth. But in my opinion, what brought Goans to Zanzibar, I would say quite confidently that it's a migration that moved from Mozambique, which was Portuguese East Africa, into Zanzibar. The traders who weren't doing well in Mozambique started moving into Zanzibar.
So this is quite interesting, the business about the Portuguese still being involved with Goans, even though from afar, right? In her book, Rochelle Pinto, Between Empires, talks about how the Goans, even though they were both obviously in Goa and in the diaspora, were affected by both the Portuguese and the British empires. And from what I recall of your first book, Into the Diaspora Wilderness, you make this point as well. So what is it about this community being so far spread away from their homeland, but still in some ways being involved in the politics of these two large empires, one bigger than the other, of course, but they were this really tiny community? How might one kind of, think about that, I suppose?
That's quite an interesting question. And, even though eventually Goans became so aligned with the British in British East Africa, initially we have this community in Zanzibar which is very, very aware of the fact that they're Portuguese citizens, and they sign themselves off in various letters as Portuguese. So they're very, very part of the Portuguese Empire in that. And it's interesting that Portugal uses Goans to claim territories, to lay claim to territories. So it uses Goans for its own expansionist policies in Africa. Says, it's occupied by Portuguese. And when you go there, you actually find Goan traders, small Goan traders who've moved into the interiors and selling shops. So in a way, we become these partners in this enterprise of colonizing land.
So on the one hand, we've got Goans as being sort of like part of this larger imperial process, right? Both, one would argue, on behalf of the Portuguese, and then also as part of the British Empire, also, right? In your new book, A Railway Runs Through, you talk about the formation of clubs, and I think one of the arguments you make, which is perhaps a little bit different from the ways in which the clubs have been discussed before, is you reckon that for the first time, the clubs were a way to enact different forms of class as opposed to caste, right? So one might say that caste still probably played a role. There might have been a coincidence between caste and class. What was different? What was it about these clubs that allowed for a new formation of life in the diaspora, where in some ways it moved away from formations in the homeland, but at the same time mirrored them as well? And this is for Eddie too, because I'm sure you have a few things to say about that as well.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Eddie in a while, because he has a lived experience of the clubs in East Africa. But I want to say that the clubs in East Africa were very central to their lives. And they were the political, economic, and social center of the lives of Goans in East Africa, and everything passed through these lives. And if you see their earliest formations, even though we have the generally accepted notion is that they're based on caste. What is very interesting is by the time the Goans get to East Africa, they're very, very conscious of the way the British work and how the British system is based on class distinctions. And so you see there's a big similarity between the constitutions of Goan clubs and the constitutions of British clubs. And Goans decide very earlier on that certain clubs of theirs are going to be elite. They're going to include only the educated. They're going to disenfranchise the uneducated, who they very openly referred to as troublemakers, illiterates, cooks, butlers, stewards, all these people. And that was not just to do with caste, but it had a lot to do with their understanding of class and of race. So there are three dynamics playing, because the earliest Goans going into East Africa are very, very aware of some of them may have been mestizo, and so they're very aware of being elite and being racially different and caste conscious. But Eddie's going to tell us about his real.
Yeah, I would certainly endorse all that Selma said, but I would go a bit further and talk about my experiences of actually living from day to day in that kind of society. Because in East Africa, I mean, we had a fairly large Goan presence in the main cities. So we had our own schools, we had, to an extent, our own church. Even the Catholic Church was predominantly Goan. We lived in government Goan quarters, so our neighbors were all Goan. We went to the Goan school, teachers were all Goans, fellow pupils were all Goan, so we had a very insulated and cloistered existence. After school, we went to the club, and there we met our friends. And it never occurred to us that there was a caste distinction. We regarded it as an economic distinction. And the Goans were not the only community to have this economic differential. Even in the Mombasa Club, where the British wouldn't allow membership to those whose income fell below a certain limit. And of course, they didn't particularly welcome the European. They wanted it to be kept as English. So there was a stratified society that we grew up in. Life evolved around the school, the Goan school, the Goan club, the Goan Institute, and we lived in Goan quarters and worked in clerical jobs together with other Goans. And this gave us a sense of belonging in a way. It was, to some extent, the Catholic Church that really broadcast the views that the Catholics were somehow superior, that they were the chosen ones of God. And this went further, of course. So we had our own clubs, we had our own life. And when we were cast adrift in Europe and had to fight our way and stand on our own feet without the support of the community, a number of people, of course, fell by the wayside there.
Eddie, what you say makes me think about the issue of multiculturalism as we might think about it today, especially in Western societies, right? But one could even argue that in India we have multicultural society. In many ways, I think the imperial project, if you will, was one of using multiculturality to its own ends, right? So it becomes really easy to retroactively think of the Indian presence in East Africa as having been an Indian presence, when in fact it was very fragmented in and of itself. So it's interesting what you say about the English, for example, not allowing the Europeans into their clubs, right? So there was an other European presence, but it was differentiated from the English, right? And we also know that the Goans set themselves apart from the other Indians, right, who would have been largely Gujarati and Punjabi, right? And I'm assuming that they had their own club formations too. Now, what I'd like to first turn our attention to is the ways in which the clubs operated, but then the way in which general life operated as well. Specifically thinking about Goan relationships with other Indians, right? Where it perhaps feeds into this multiculturalism I'm talking about, which is a product of the imperial enterprise. But the ways in which Goans took that upon themselves as well, perhaps thinking of themselves as being Portuguese or British or whatever the case was, but certainly apart from Indians. And then I want to keep this for a second separate from the question of Goan relationships with Africans, which we'll get to as well.
Right, this is very long, very complex, not long, but long and complex situation as to the relationships between Goans and Indians. Because the diaspora in East Africa is predominantly Catholic. And they go there with being very aware, right from the beginning, that they're different from Indians. But if you look at their earliest relationships, when they're just arriving in the late 1800s, there is a great deal of dependency between the Indians and the Goans. They work for each other, they depend on each other for business, they live very close to each other. So there is a dependency, but they never mix socially. Socially, they're two different and distinct categories of people. And so you never have them mixing in their clubs. Their places of worship are different, the places of school are different. And as the population of Goans increases, this solidifies. And the British, of course, reinforced it because to the British, Goans were Goans. And they create this whole era about Goans, which is possibly, anchored by some truth to it. That Goans are these absolute model citizens of honesty and integrity and trustworthiness, and Goans are people that we can trust with our eyes closed. And then there's this further distancing between Indians and Goans, and until there's this complete breakup where Goans want separate political representation from Indians. And I'm going to hand it over to Eddie to find out the real life experience.
In employment, the Goans were largely worked in the civil service, and they were clear in the banks as well. They were well regarded as being honest and trustworthy, because they were also seen as very religious lot who went to church and obeyed the commandments of the church and the commandments of God, and that they were God-fearing, yes. So they were really used by the British in order to administer the territories and to worked very well as far as the administration went. But they were also rewarded with fairly comfortable lives and a lot of perks. Besides accommodation, lots of them had all kinds of housing allowances and leave annually, not just annually, but every 5 years, 6 months home leave to go back to go to Goa. And that came in very useful.
Eddie, that's really interesting because I think to some extent what you're identifying for us is that the community was not entirely just a diaspora community, it was actually a transnational community, right? Because they moved back and forth. It wasn't just that they were based in East Africa. One of the criticisms, I think, of the ways in which British East African, Goan British East African history is told and Selma, I know I've taken you to task for this as well, is the ways in which women are represented, or better yet, are not represented, right? So very often the way we get told about the British East African story, as far as Goans is concerned, is in how it was a very male-specific history, right? And I'm thinking here specifically of the work of history that predates your book, and I won't mention any names, but there are women in this book, but we always hear about them as being someone's wife or someone's daughter, right? And we never actually get their names themselves, right? I think in the new book, in A Railroad Runs Through, you make a space for us to think about how women were part of life in Goan life in East Africa. So I think the two specific questions I have, both you and Eddie, are: one is, why are women left out of this larger history? And two, what are the ways in which we can think about the presence of women in this history without mirroring a history that's always been about the model minority, if you will, right? Is there a way to think of a female presence in this history that doesn't mirror masculine representation of history?
That's a very interesting question, Benny, because as we've discussed so often, history is always written from the point of view of men. One of the reasons that happens is because men leave records of themselves. Whereas how do women remember their stories? It's usually through the oral tradition. They relay the stories to their children, and the children relay them to the further generations. So there are two different ways of how women carry stories and how men carry stories. But it's very, very interesting about the role women played in East Africa. When we think of migrations, we have to remember that migration could only take place if there were courageous women willing to follow, willing to accompany their men into these lands, which were very inhospitable, mostly to childbirth. It was difficult. There was a high infant mortality. A lot of children died after they were born. And they're very arduous conditions. And one of the things we see about Goan women in East Africa is that they really come into their own. You see a lot of them married older men in those days. You know, East African men would come back. By the time they came back from East Africa, they were well into their 30s. My own grandfather was 38, and when he came back, he married the lovely Maria Agustina, and she was only 16. And they died. Mostly these men would die. And you see these women then assuming the role, taking on these businesses, and they would run these businesses. And so you see a society becoming more gender balanced in their power. Women are not as powerless as they are in contemporary Indian societies of the same era. And so there's a great empowerment of women because they have to take on these roles. And I believe that is one of the major transformations of Goan society that has made us so progressive. It's this gender equality that we have. And that's not just because of the Portuguese, it's also because of these influences we've had in the diaspora.
Yes, I certainly agree that quite a few Goan women were quite outstanding, and not just in supporting their husbands, but also in their own right. But I think this was a minority, and by and large, the tendency, it's a generational thing as well. I mean, if you go back to maybe up to the 1950s, the families tended to be fairly large. This was the case in Goa as well. And the woman had to stay at home in order to look after the children. She couldn't think in terms of having a separate career. Usually the husband earned quite well, and the wife was quite happy to stay at home and manage the household. But of course there were cases where women were able to progress in their own right, not just in the professional. At one time, up to the 1950s, I would say, it was largely a question of women. If they got a job, it was as a secretary or a nurse. These were the two most common professions, and very few of them aspired to anything more than that. But as in the later period, there was quite a diversifying of the professional qualifications and opportunities as well available to not just to Goan women but to all Asian women who were able to seize professional jobs.
You know, I want to go back a little bit to where we started with the class issue. So, you know, in many ways, if, as I said earlier, the history is remembered as one being predominantly about men, it's also a history that's remembered predominantly as being about the clerical class and being about the administrators. But there were tailors, there were sailors, there were people who occupied working class positions, right? So clearly, it was not just the clerical class that was that made up, probably didn't even make up the bulk of the Goan East African presence, right? A, why did they get forgotten? B, how do we remember that part?
I think that's very similar to why women get forgotten. It's because their stories, again, are not written anywhere. When you go back, there's no sort of physical record of them writing down things. But I want to make this point is that we have to be very indebted to all the tailors and cooks and carpenters and bakers and small petty tradesmen who went to East Africa, because it was not the clerks who went there. It was these small-time people who went there, and they are the ones who actually are the forebearers of our migration. And they, very sadly, their role is forgotten in society and in history, and they're kind of invisibilized, if I can use that word, very sadly, and diminished. And their contribution is diminished. When we think about East Africans now, we think exclusively of East African clerks, but that's not true. There were so many other people and who led very small lives, but who are responsible for the well-being and the affluence that we experience in Goa today.
Well, there's very little I can add to that, because it is so true of the opportunities and the aspirations that we had was to have a comfortable existence, and the Goans, by and large, led a reasonably comfortable life.
And you know, in your opening, Selma, you rather timidly mentioned the relationship between Goans and East Africans, and this is something that I think, you know, so we've got the lack of recognition of women, we've got the lack of recognition of working class and lower class. In the history of Goan British East Africa, and clearly a lack of the telling of the relationships between Goans and black folk in East Africa. I wonder if part of the problem is that what history looks for is the very large interactions, right? So the big names, Pio Gama Pinto, ACL D'Souza, right? Folks like these who were part of the politics of decolonization, right? And the role that they played that they wouldn't have been able to play if they were not part of African nationalism, right? But then what about the everyday interactions, right? The ways in which Goan people lived with African folk, right? Might have had sexual relations with men, right? might have left kith and kin behind who we refuse to recognise as being part of our community. And that is one of the reasons why we don't want to recognise that history as well, the everyday history. So if we could think about that a little bit.
The part about Africans and Goans having sexual relations is in fact should be an entire chapter. And like you said, we don't talk about those things. In fact, I believe recently someone has said that that's something I shouldn't have mentioned in my book, because we don't want to ever think of ourselves as having sexual relationships with people who were black, because, you know, even today we have this thing, oh, she looks very nice, but she's black. So that's a reality of our race relations. As to what the relationship between Goans and Africans were, I think the sad fact is there was no relationships. We think of the British as racist, but we also have to admit that Goans are inherently racist, and we are terribly racist towards people who are black, who we see as illiterate, feckless, delinquent, given to all sorts of behavior which is untoward. And so you have a great span of period where there is absolutely no relationships between Africans and Goans. And the only relationships they have is that of servant. They would employ them as menials in their house. So that's the only relationship Goans have. And but I have to also say that despite our racism, we were at the core Catholics. And I think because we were Catholics, we felt in a way responsible for these Africans. And a lot of Goans did take care of the people they employed. They made sure they got a little bit of education. They made sure their children were taken care of. They made sure they had little shelter. So in little ways they improved their lives.
Again, I think it's very much a generational thing over a period of time. In the 40s and 50s, the blacks, the Goans treated, and not just the Goans, but all Asians, and the whites as well, treated the Asians, the blacks, with deference and looked down on them. But in the mid-50s and the 60s, things began to change. And particularly after independence, where there was some intermarriage between the Goans and the blacks and the natives as well. And they were looked on as equals. The independence, of course, made a great difference. But what I would like to point out is the nationalistic struggle that was going on in Kenya in the 1950s with the Mau Mau uprising and the independence movement was mirrored with the struggle in Goa to free Goa from Portuguese rule. And by and large, the very same people who were nationalistic and supported were against the British rule in Kenya, were the same people who were opposed to the Portuguese rule in Goa.
Thanks for that. That's actually a great point on which to end this part of the discussion. One of the wonderful things about an event like this is that the audience gets to interact with the writer. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience for Selma and for Eddie as well. And apparently from here. If you could introduce yourself, please, before your question. Thank you. And then I think Agashtu is next.
Rajan Narayan. You see, to what extent did the village identity subsume or transcend the club identity? Eddie, for instance, knows that the Confederation of Goan Clubs fought each other so much, and the clubhouse burnt down, and the whole thing came crumbling down.
Yeah, the burning, I think you're talking about the clubhouse in the UK. But yes, that's an interesting question about village identities. There's something about these clubs. You see where the Goan populations were so small, like as in Malawi, they couldn't splinter. So you have tailors and clerks together as part of one house. Now the problems began when the population were large, as in Nairobi. And there, then you have strength in numbers. Then you have people who are Brahmins saying that people who are Chardos cannot be part, and Chardos saying people who are, less than us have to be somewhere else. So in Nairobi, you'll find the greatest fragmentation of Goans they have the 3 distinct clubs. As far as the village connection goes, I can say with some degree that it was perhaps not, and maybe Eddie can verify this, it was more prominent in places of work. You see, if you had a person from Moira or Saligao in one department, you could be pretty much sure that everyone in that department would be recruited from Moira and Saligao. So that is where the exclusion and village affiliations came in more. But in the club, I understand it was more on caste lines. And maybe Eddie can shed some light on it.
I think the caste differences got somewhat diluted when it came to the village level. This was true with the East African, in the larger cities anyway, in the larger towns. But in the UK, the numbers of Goans belonging to, or who did belong to a particular village, were rather limited, and there wasn't any kind of distinction shown, even with the main club in the UK. But differences existed, of course, amongst Goans, and even at work level. One of my favorite stories is in the 1960s, when Goan complained that his boss, who was also a Goan, discriminated against him. And this case went to the Employment Bureau, Employment Tribunal, where this whole matter of racial discrimination. But the person who was complaining was a Hindu Goan, and his boss was a Catholic Goan. And the chairman of the tribunal very wisely pointed out that even though you have small ethnic groups, discrimination and resentment can still arise. And his example was in Ireland, where the Catholics were at war with the Protestants. And he found, in fact, in favor of the Hindu Goan, and the Catholic Goan was reprimanded.
Yeah, I'm Augusto Pinto, born in 1961 in Nairobi. And even though I can say I benefited from the Goan experience of migration in to East Africa, I'd also like to say that I make no bones about it that we were there as exploiters. The only thing was that when we were there, we didn't realize it. When there's a hegemony operating, you don't think of these things. It's later on that you come to think about it. In fact, even now, if I try to bring these matters up with my sister, who lives in England, she very vehemently denies that there was any, racism or colonialism. The Europeans, in fact, they didn't call it the English, if you recall, were isolated from the Africans to a great extent, and we were on the front line with meaning the Indians and us were, there could be seen, and we had to deal with them. We didn't realize the harm that we had done to them by building that railway, for instance. Well, I guess that had to happen at some point or another. Anyway, I'll leave this nostalgia, this kind of myth building, because every community requires these kinds of things. And look at the future. I feel that the Goan community, which got built up in East Africa, particularly, is leading and will in future lead to the elimination of all Goans, that Goanness of Catholic Goans particularly. Because one thing that Selma or Margaret Friends, or for that matter earlier on Stella Mascarena's schemes, don't really touch upon is the migration that has been occurring over the last 20 years, where villages after villages you find Goans leaving and making a Portuguese passport and going to the United Kingdom, and once they are there, they are hooked. They just can't get away from it. But they can't make a Goan community like what had happened in East Africa. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, you've become international Lamanis.
Sure. And quite frankly, I've lost the question, but I'm just kidding, I was. No, first of all, in terms of community, we have to ask ourselves, what is a community? Well, what is a Goan community in Goa? I mean, someone who lives in Panjim has a different sense of community compared to someone who lives in a village in Nube. So our sense of what is a community is always changing. And secondly, I don't think someone who emigrates should hold on to a sense of Goanness, because cultures are dynamic, they're always in a state of change. So the sense that there is something that we should hold on to is wrong. But as to whether migration will eliminate the Goan identity, I think yes, of course, from an emotional point of view, and I feel that way. I am the very essence of the Goan Catholic, culture. Of course, we want to hold on to the past, but we can't. We have to evolve. And as for Goans leaving Goa, I think the fundamental question is, why do people leave? People have always left because of economic reasons, for no other reason. And it's something that we have to introspect on what we can do to retain. So that's it. Okay, we're just going to take one last question because I do want to call upon, okay, there are two more questions. We will take two more questions.
My name is Eugene. Yes.
Yes, Eugene.
Yeah. One of the things happened recently after the exodus. Hello. Hello. Yeah. After the exodus and which followed up, people came to Canada and so on and so on. They brought the same things which were prevailing in East Africa to Canada and all. I, as a Bombay Goan, had a lot of problems with African Goans. And the GOA then stood for Goans of Africa. Bombay Goans would never join them. I was forced to be on the committee, and people asked my friend, how can you work with these Goans from Africa? They're nuts. They're together, they're clannish. And I did see. At the dance, they would be together. I said, you form your own group and dance together. Doesn't matter. And I had a lot of problems, a lot of fights with them. But till today, that persists. So the club culture has been transformed. So what's the changes? Nothing. Nothing has changed basically.
Okay, well, I guess I have to apologize that you couldn't get the dance that you wanted.
Oh, not with you.
And better luck next time finding that dance partner. But but as with the club culture, first of all, let's admit that it's dying. It's a culture where you'll see elderly people and you will not see the next generation coming in. So we are always in a state of change.
It's not specifically a Goan. It's not specifically a Goan phenomenon either. It's something that happens in diaspora communities wherever you go. I think. Yeah.
Selma, I just wanted to ask you one question about who are the Goans who used to migrate to Eastern Africa and to Portuguese Africa? Was it a matter of class and caste? I have my own views, but I don't want to say them. I can in the graduate level, and I was teaching at Goan University.
I think there's some good research done on this actually, and I can't give you figures off the top of my head, but we know that most of the migration took place from the Vela Conquistas, and I'm not sure what sort of class of people were migrating to Mozambique. But I can say that they were Portuguese-speaking Goans.
Yes.
And that might be a small clue that they were fairly elite Goans.
Right.
And I can also say, with some degree of certainty, that the earliest migration to Zanzibar were again Portuguese-speaking Goans, because they sent out all their circulars and things like that in Portuguese whenever they had to make. A little bit of class eliteness there, but I have to say, almost simultaneously, there were a lot of Konkani-speaking Goans that migrated.
I'm going to turn it over to Selma to introduce our guest who will be releasing the book.
As I said, we're very lucky today to have the grandson of Dr. A.C.L. D'Souza with us today. Dr. A.C.L. D'Souza was a very prominent Goan in East Africa. He was a doctor. He arrived there in 1915. And I really should do a proper introduction for him, but I can't, I don't have enough time. But he became the political voice of Goans, and he's best remembered as the father of Goan education in East Africa. And Dr. Alan Rodrigues is his grandson. He's been in the field of education since 1978. He's the principal of the prestigious Vidya Vikas Academy in Margao since 1997. And he's accompanied by students of the Vidya Vikas Academy Literary Club. The school encourages them to pursue their talents and promotes visits to events such as this. Can I call on Dr. Alan Rodrigues to say a few words?
Thank you, Selma. Eminent and distinguished members in the audience, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear students. Let me begin by acknowledging the contribution of the Goans to the many countries they have moved to and settled in. No matter what their chosen field of work was, Goans have always greatly contributed to and impacted life in the countries that they lived in. Growing up as a schoolboy, I can't forget a remark often made to us Goans, that we were the A, B, C, and D of society, referring to ayahs, butlers, cooks, and drivers. But even they, as I remember, were respected and admired by their employers for their dedicated services. Now that's one end of the swing of the pendulum, and there are also the other many eminent Goans as the pendulum swings to the other side. I use the analogy of the pendulum and not the ladder to remind ourselves of the equality of mankind, something that we Indians need to remember today. I'm reminded here of Faustine, a lady from Kalangut who worked for more than 50 years at the home of our neighbors, a very respectable Khoja family. She brought up their 4 sons and worked with them for over a period of 50 years. When she finally grew old and moved back to Goa, this family set up a fund for her so that she would be looked after and cared for in her old age. At her funeral, which I was also present at, the entire family came down to Kalangut. And the mother of these boys paid a lasting tribute to her when she said, "She was more of a mother to my sons than I was." And that dedication has been witnessed in Goans all over the world. Sadly, Goans also carried with them the obnoxious caste system, and this more often than not denigrated many Goans and their tremendous contribution to Goan society. To the youngsters in this audience, the school and college students, being a writer is kind of a peculiar task. It's always you versus a blank paper. Very often the paper wins. But that is definitely not the case with Selma, whose writings do justice to her chosen subject. I want to thank you, Selma, for inviting me here this morning. It is an honor to launch a railway runs through. This honor to me also honors the memory of my late grandfather, Dr. A.C.L. D'Souza, and his contribution to Goans and to Kenya in the field of medicine, journalism, and public service. The life of Dr. A.C.L. D'Souza, his wife, Dr. Mary D'Souza, and his son, Dr. Peter D'Souza, epitomize the selfless sacrifice and contribution of many Goans to life in Kenya. I look forward to reading the book, but from what I have been able to gather from various sources, it chronicles a relationship with East Africa which endures over a century. It documents a community whose relentlessly intrepid and pioneering soul takes them to the frontier lands of East Africa. For Selma, it is a culmination of years of field interviews, archival research, and offers a fascinating glimpse, perhaps for the first time, of a never-before encountered Goan. This book must find its place in the libraries of schools and colleges in Goa. To the youngsters in this audience, history, through the writings of such authors, plays an important role in our understanding of world events, which have a deep impact on our own perspective of life. Friends, may we have a round of applause for this versatile and talented young writer who we as Goans can truly be proud of. And Selma, thank you once again for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here this afternoon.
Selma, come to the center.